Welcome to La Mia Italy, a series of videos about Italy by a Brit with Italian blood who has lived in both countries and loves them both. This is the first of two short videos on what you need to know about the history of Italy to better understand and appreciate the country today. I will try to explain why the north and south of Italy are so different, why Italians aren't very good at paying taxes, why the first king of Italy was Victor Emanuel the Second, and why many Italians say it is a country united only by football. We could go back further, but let's start with the Romans. Many people wonder when looking at present-day Italy, how is it possible that this was the centre of one of the greatest empires the world has ever seen? The Roman Empire fell a long time ago, and by the time of its decline, it was a mix of peoples from across half the known world, most of it not ruled from Italy, and very different from the days of Imperial Rome. If you wanted to be unkind, and accept a tongue-in-cheek generalisation, you could say the people at the end of the Roman Empire didn't pay their taxes and relied on others to provide military protection, which may sound familiar. So let's skip forward nearly 1,500 years, past the Renaissance and the many city-states such as Venice and Florence, to the early years of the 19th century. I'm not saying that the Renaissance wasn't Italian, just that it was a long way from a single unified country. So what was Italy like in the early years of the 19th century? Much of the north of Italy, Lombardy and Il Veneto, are ruled by the Austrians. That's the yellow area of the map and includes Milan and Venice. The Pope rules much of the centre, known as the Papal States, the purple area on the map, and that includes Rome. The Bourbon monarchy, which is an offshoot of the Spanish royal family, rules the south. There are some independent states, such as the Kingdom of Piemonte, the Duchies of Tuscany, Modena and Parma, and even little San Marino. By the way, Piemonte is the brown area on the map in the northwest, bordering France. Now these areas are very, very different. The Austrians and Piemontese are, relatively speaking, fairly progressive with decent administration, education, and things more or less work. They are the first parts of Italy to industrialise, and almost all the first Italian railways are in those areas. The Bourbons and the Papal States, on the other hand, are reactionary, agricultural, with little having changed for centuries. In fact, the near-feudal Bourbons are unpopular with other monarchies like Britain for giving monarchy a bad name. One of my favourite parts of Italy is Umbria, which was part of the Papal States. If you go there now, you see the lovely hilltop towns with a fortress or rocca at the top, and at first glance it looks harmonious and picturesque. What is easy to miss is how oppressive and stark these fortresses really are, located above the lively towns below, filled with their churches, culture and bustle. These pictures are from Assisi, but in Perugia it is even more brutal. The papal fortress, the Rocca Paolina, was literally built on top of the city centre streets. It was largely dismantled after Italian unification, but the medieval streets below remain. You can imagine how the locals felt, and why these regions were voting communist rather than Christian Democrat 100 years later. It's hard to talk about nationalism these days without thinking of extremism, but in the 19th century nationalism was very different. It was liberal and democratic. It was about freeing people from foreign oppression, and Italy, which had been dominated by foreign invaders for centuries, was in pole position to benefit from this. A lot of different forces were pressing for some sort of Italian unity. Mazzini and Garibaldi on the more radical side, who wanted republics. Victor Emanuel the Second of Piemonte, who wanted a constitutional monarchy, albeit one under him. Romantics like Byron, Shelley and Goethe. The French and British, who wanted to weaken their rival Austria, and, of course, the Italians themselves. There was a false start in 1848, the year of revolutions across Europe, when many people rose up against their oppressors. In Milan, the rebellion against the Austrians was particularly brutal, although it started as a campaign of civil disobedience. It wasn't long before it turned into a fully fledged uprising, known as the Cinque Giornate di Milano, the 5 days of Milan. The uprising failed and many died at the hands of the Austrian army, led by Marshal Radetzky. If you go to Piazza Cinque Giornate in Milan today, the monument commemorating it shows the suffering, with a woman covering her eyes to avoid seeing the horror which was happening around her. I used to walk past it every day when I lived in Milan, and it made an impression on me, as did the roads in the area, which were named after the patriots, and you could see how young they were when they died. It was such a disaster that a 48, or 48, means just that in Italian, a disaster. Meanwhile, Marshal Radetzky returned to Vienna, and a hero's welcome and his very own victory march. We should say a bit more about the Piemontese, by which I mean the kingdom ruled by Victor Emanuel the Second from Turin. This included Sardinia, Nice and Savoy in France, as well as Piemonte itself. They were fairly military, although not in a scary Prussian way, and they weren't too threatening, so had a minor place at the table of the big nations, alongside France, Britain and Russia. It was a constitutional monarchy with a parliament and a prime minister. For much of this time, the prime minister was Camillo Cavour, who was a wily statesman intent on unifying Italy. He ensured the Piemontese sent a force to fight with the French and the British in the Crimean War, as he knew their support would be needed later for Italian unification. By the way, if you see the word Sabauda in Italian, it is referring to Savoy and the Piemontese. It took me a while to work that out. One reason the composer Giuseppe Verdi is such an icon of Italian unification is that nationalists used to write Viva Verdi on the walls, meaning long live Vittorio Emanuele, Re d'Italia, V-E-R-D-I, you get it? As a subtle way of agitating for independence. I'm not sure I believe the Austrians didn't see through this, but perhaps opera fans were more prone to writing on walls back then. I guess it's a bit like the graffiti ACAB or 1312 these days. Almost every city, town and village in Italy has a Piazza Garibaldi, a Corso Cavour, a Via Mazzini, or statue of Victor Emanuel, and he also has the monument known as the Wedding Cake in the centre of Rome. But it would be wrong to see them as all working together. The reality is that Victor Emanuel and Cavour would have been happy to hang Mazzini and Garibaldi as dangerous revolutionaries. Mazzini was a firm republican, and even Cavour was known to shout at the king and tell him a good king would know when to abdicate. How Italy came together is still relevant to how Italy is today, and even though these events happened mainly in the 1860s, it isn't that long ago in the overall scheme of the history of nations. I won't go into much detail on the process which resulted in unification. Garibaldi, who was a real revolutionary and a very effective general fighting for republicanism in South America and later in France, landed in Sicily in the hope that the locals would unite around him against the Bourbons. Although he was a republican, he accepted that the best chance of a united Italy was to unite under Victor Emanuel, as the European monarchies weren't going to stand for a republic. He is criticised by many as naive, but I respect his pragmatism, and I think he was probably right. Meanwhile, while Garibaldi and his red shirts were fighting in the south, Victor Emanuel and Cavour were fighting, with the support of the French, to drive the Austrians out of Lombardy and the Veneto, and to add them to Piemonte. Garibaldi and his red shirts were a huge success, and they chased the Bourbons out of Sicily in the south. He also stayed true to his word and met Victor Emanuel in Naples to hand him the south of Italy. Victor Emanuel gratefully accepted it, whilst pondering how he could rid himself of Garibaldi, who was sure to be troublesome at some point. That opportunity soon arose when Garibaldi, having seen off the Bourbons, wanted to keep going and kick the Pope out of central Italy and Rome. As you can see from the map, Italy was almost united and the Pope had been pushed back, but nobody thought Italian unification could be properly achieved without Rome. But it is one thing to free yourself from the foreign Austrian rulers, it is another to invade Rome and fight the Pope. And Catholic France, for one, wasn't going to accept that, and nor was Victor Emanuel. Nonetheless, that didn't stop Garibaldi trying, and within a year his red shirts were squaring up to fight their former Piemontese allies, who by now were calling themselves the Army of Italy. It ended at the Battle of Aspromonte in 1862, when the Italian forces were successful. Garibaldi survived but was shot twice, which suggests that he was targeted, so no gratitude from Victor Emanuel. Meanwhile, the Pope nervously remained in Rome, and Florence, at least for the time being, was the capital of the new Italy. This isn't a glorious start to the new Italy. The Italian nationalists are fighting each other, literally. The Italian state is at war with the Pope in an overwhelmingly Catholic country, and the Pope is threatening to excommunicate those fighting against him, and actually does excommunicate Victor Emanuel. There was a need for legitimacy, and a referendum or plebiscite was held, by which the South voted to join the Kingdom of Italy with an implausible 99.85% of the vote. Many places have a Via del Plebiscito to commemorate this. This is the period covered in the novel The Leopard, or Il Gattopardo, by Giovanni Tomasi de Lampedusa, which in my mind is a masterpiece. The Bourbon Count, played by Burt Lancaster in the film, helps his young nephew, Alain Delon, fight first for Garibaldi, and then joined the Piemontese fighting against him. But why are they so sympathetic to the New World? As Alain Delon famously says, if we want things to stay as they are, things will have to change. The northern Italians have great plans for Sicily in the south, but the wily old count tells them not to bother. The Sicilians don't want to change. But why, say the northerners, look at all the poverty around you? Because the Sicilians consider themselves perfect, says the count. You can't keep a good man down, and Garibaldi, with some help from Victor Emanuel, continues the fight and eventually takes Rome and the Papal States in 1870. There is fighting in Rome, and at Porta Pia the walls are finally breached. Incidentally, the British Embassy is next door. It looks so modern because Israeli nationalists blew up the old one in 1946. The Pope retreats to the Vatican within the city of Rome. Even Victor Emanuel and Garibaldi draw the line at firing on or destroying St. Peter's, so the furious Pope remains at war with the new Italian state. The state responds by being secular, so no crosses in schools or state buildings, and the Roman authorities go out of their way to antagonise the Pope, including by putting up a statue to Giordano Bruno, who was burnt at the stake by the Church as a heretic for arguing that the earth may not be the centre of the universe. It's no accident that his rather menacing statue in Campo de' Fiori in Rome is looking directly at the Vatican. This awkward state of affairs will last until 1929, when Mussolini reaches a peace settlement or reconciliation with the Pope. I think the Pope would have been better off striking a deal with Victor Emanuel, but then again, I'm not infallible. So why does any of this matter nowadays? Firstly, the Italian state and its pre-unification predecessors were historically weak, and people were used to finding ways around their rules. There was a culture of relying on your extended family rather than the state to protect you, of banditry and secret societies against foreign oppressors. You can probably see where that strand is going. Secondly, there hasn't really been time for Italy to develop a more uniform character. It's not that other countries don't have regional differences, it's just that Italy's are that much more obvious. Look at the electoral success of La Lega in recent elections and their campaign for northern independence, or the incredibly wide range of dialects and accents. And thirdly, although the South was sort of liberated and sort of agreed to become part of the North, ultimately one foreign monarchy was replaced by another, and that's why the first king of Italy was Victor Emanuel the Second. It was a takeover. He didn't even bother resetting the clock and calling himself Victor Emanuel the First. So finally, let's spare a thought for Garibaldi. A true hero in my opinion. I think he's been poorly served by history, and we take him for granted. Perhaps his look hasn't aged well, and he appears conservative rather than the radical he really was. After unification, he went to fight for the French Republic against the Prussians, who invaded France, and he ended his days living a simple life on the island of Caprera, off the coast of Sardinia, tending his sheep. The best way to remember Garibaldi is in his heyday, when hundreds of thousands of Londoners turned out to greet him in Trafalgar Square, as a true hero of his age. They even named a biscuit after him. Squash flies, anyone? I hope you found this useful. I'm planning to do a part 2 which will take us up to the start of the Second World War. In the meantime, in bocca al lupo, and I'll see you soon.